Great. We're going to go ahead and kick things off if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
We are live on Facebook, and I am so excited to speak with you a little bit about the work that you're doing. But first, to the Facebook community, we are here speaking. Oh, give me one second. We are here speaking today with Dr. McCoy about her presentation at the annual NASW New Jersey conference. We're going to dive into a little bit about your background as a social worker, the work that you focus on, and some of the pressing issues in our community. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, we do have some of our team there watching the comment section. So if you have a couple of questions you want to pop in, we'll be keeping an eye on those and we can ask them of you. But I'm so excited, Dr. McCoy, for you to be joining us here today and sharing your experiences with us. You have just the most impressive resume, and you're currently a professor at University in Chicago, correct?
Chicago, right.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey in social work and how you arrived at what your current focus is.
Sure. So I am maybe like many social workers that kind of figured out they wanted to do social work in an unusual path. I started college as a business major and was awful at it and hated it, and was doing volunteer work. The university that I went to had a campus YMCA, and was doing volunteer work on the side, and ended up being a volunteer probation officer in the community. At the same time, figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And so I switched majors. I started majoring in sociology and African American studies. And as a part of that, took a sociology class that was cross-listed in social work, and discovered the other end of campus that I didn't know that existed, which was the College of Social Work, and had been thinking about industrial and labor relations, but really loved that class. It was called Poverty in America. And I thought, oh, wow, you can like make a living doing this. And all the volunteer work that I was doing, you could actually do that too. And so I applied to graduate schools of social work, and that was kind of the beginning for me. So I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania and thought I wanted to work with adults, but my first field placement was in a public high school in South Philadelphia, in a program that was focused on getting social workers back into public schools. They've been out of the schools a number of years due to a contractual difference with guidance counselors, and worked with teenagers who had failed their freshman year. They were interested in getting back on track, so they were earning 2 years in one, and just discovered that I absolutely loved working with adolescents. I loved working, I'm a city girl, I'm from Chicago. I loved working in an urban public high school. I didn't go to public schools, and so that was a new experience. It was huge. And I found, I think, my passion at that point. So that kind of started me on my way. I returned back to Chicago, and like lots of social workers, had many jobs at the same time, often 2 or 3, right? I had my job during the week, I had my weekend job, and I had my holiday job. But what they all had in common were often young people who had mental health needs that were, I thought, not necessarily being diagnosed accurately. Many of them had contact with the legal system. And so I kind of begun to think maybe I'm interested in a PhD. I'm not really sure. But what I did know is that I was interested in understanding a lot more about young adults, particularly young Black men, particularly Black boys, who it seemed to me were being misdiagnosed. So they were getting a lot of diagnoses with conduct disorder, optional defiant disorder, and I just saw depression. And I thought, I don't know if this makes sense to me. And as I did what we do, right, read social work and, my monthly journal, and I just wasn't seeing the literature and looking in other things, and thought I wanted to go back and get a PhD and be able to perhaps share a different voice about what I was seeing through a really different cultural lens. And all of that kind of landed me here. I got a master of jurisprudence because I wanted to understand the law better, to be a better social worker. And that kind of culminated into my work, which predominantly focuses on young Black boys who have mental health needs that precipitate their involvement in the juvenile legal system, and how those needs are criminalized. And then as an extension of that, young Black men, 18 to 24, and their experiences with violence, and how there's a perception that Black men experience violence because they've done something wrong, and me thinking that likely was not true. And in fact, my research has begun to show that it's not about doing something wrong. What they have in common is that they're Black and male. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
We're going to get to that in just a second too, because I really want to piggyback on some of the research that you're doing and what you know to be true from a social work lens, and some of the present day happenings here in the state of New Jersey. But one of the things that you say in your bio is that you became a professor for representation reasons. I'd love if you could expand a little bit more about that. Tell us a little bit more about that journey.
Sure. So, it was interesting. I had a few Black professors throughout my kind of collegiate experience and graduate school experience, but not a lot, certainly. And in my MSW program, I was fortunate. I went to University of Pennsylvania, and they have and continue to have, they celebrate their 50th year anniversary last year, a sequence in racism. And I was fortunate to have really influential Black professors there, and knew that had been missing through most of my collegiate career, except as an African American Studies major, and really thought back on my experiences in terms of what other students were seeing as I was a field director, or I was a field instructor, and could see both in what my students were learning and what my clients were experiencing, that there needed to be additional voices, and that this was something I could add, and tried out by joining the Jane Addams College of Social Work in an administrative role and a clinical faculty role to see, was it something I really wanted to do, and decided it was. So my goal has been at least to provide students of color, particularly Black students, someone that looks like them, and for them to think about either in a clinical role, academic, policymaker, whatever, that they can have opportunities as well, that it's not closed to them.
I think that's so incredibly important in all spaces, that there be representation, and that representation is diversity of thought, and it makes all of the work that we do stronger. And the youth of today also need to see that there's opportunities for them, but there's also voices that are really speaking on their behalf and have similar lived experiences. So it's so important. I want to go back to something, the idea of working with Black men and boys. I shared with you before our conversation some of the incidents that are happening here locally in Bridgewater. We had an incident at the Bridgewater Mall in the last week that there was an altercation between two young boys, and the police were called. One of the youth was Black, one was white. The Black youth was handcuffed. This is something we're continuing to see in our society, even though it just seems so clear that there's a problem and it would stop. I wonder if you have thoughts on these emerging stories that we continue to see.
Well, I think the fact is we're seeing stories that have long happened. The difference is that most people have cameras with them now. And so we're only beginning to see a very small number of stories that happen every day. I think what we also have to remind ourselves is the number that we're probably seeing on film don't come close to the number that we're not seeing on film. That particular story, which of course was shared with me before this, represents, I think, what often happens is you had a young 14-year-old kid, you had a police officer who put her knee in his neck, you had another one handcuffed him on the ground, the other kid got away, he was completely compliant, he was engaged in a juvenile fight. It wasn't that he assaulted someone else. In fact, he was the one thrown against a piece of furniture. But what we know is that it's much more likely that in that situation it's always assumed that it's the Black kid that did something wrong, be it a boy or a girl. And when you listen to his story saying he defended someone, of course we weren't there, but it certainly resonates with what we know often happens, be it young boys, young girls, and adult women and men as well. And I think also transgender populations that we often forget about that also experience inordinate violence by police. So this is related to our long history in this country of perceptions about Black people, and how we've continued to try to reiterate those perceptions. And I think we can look around in our current state of society and see how, racism isn't new. We didn't have a sudden awakening. What we have is people increasing their comfort level with sharing how they feel, and those long, deep-seated feelings of hate that really are built into the foundation of this country.
It's so true. I think there has become a culture of just acceptance of
Submissiveness, encouragement, modeling. I mean, there's so many words to describe, I think, what some people want to say is a new phenomenon. It's not new. It's just that there's a lot more people sharing what they already think and feel. Right.
And the harm that is being done today, it's just absolutely incredible and difficult. Your presentation at conference this year talks a little bit about the history and present day and the colliding of it and being Black in America, race-based trauma. I wonder if you could share just a brief overview of this presentation and what our participants are going to be able to hear and learn from you.
Sure. So I think what's important, and I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, which is somehow people think that this is kind of a point in place in time that all of these behaviors are new, but we know that's not true. We know that the way that individuals that were enslaved and people before that who came as indentured servants came to this country under already decided beliefs about Black people. And so we know that I'm currently working on a manuscript with some friends that and some colleagues that talk about policing and anti-racist and transformative policing, and acknowledging that policing stems from slave patrols in this country, which were designed to make sure that people who were enslaved stayed on plantations and that those who were not enslaved were sent to plantations, et cetera. So we seem to forget that this is all part of our history. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing behaviors that have continued to just show up in different ways. You know, we went from formal slavery to, leased quote unquote convicts to Jim Crow laws. I mean, we always have something that is designed to keep a certain group of people, Black people, in a certain place. So we can't talk about the experiences that we're having now without first acknowledging what we've experienced in the past and how each of those morphs into just a new policy and new practice and how that impacts everyone, right? Because when we're not all doing well, we have a problem. When a small group isn't doing well, we have a problem. So my presentation will talk about that. It will remind people of our history and perhaps for some people introduce them to history, and then really talk about how it's connected to the phenomena that we have now. Everything from social and economic disparities, the societal determinants of health, structural violence, structural racism, et cetera. It's all, connected together. And I think what's important is that we'll see that they're treated separately, and if there is not, as if there's not a relationship, but in fact, we know that that's not true. So hopefully I'll be able to share in that period of time a capsule of what that is and pique people's interest enough that they'll want to know more.
Well, I don't think that will be a problem at all. It is absolutely a conversation that needs to happen, and understanding how our history just continues to repeat itself, shows up in different ways in different spaces, but it's absolutely critical conversation for us to have. I'm so grateful for your work and for the research that you're doing and your leadership within the social work profession. And I'm incredibly excited to listen in on your presentation at our conference this year. So thank you so much for joining us.
Having me, yes.
And for joining us on a quick Facebook Live so people can get to know some of our speakers this year at our conference and get a little taste of what they're going to experience. I know that people are going to want to join me in this conversation, and we're really looking forward to it.
Great. I'm looking forward to it too. It's always, I get to learn something new as well in conversation. So I'm looking forward to having it.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you at the NASW New Jersey conference this year.
Great. See everyone there.
Bye.
Bye.